Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I'm here today to recap the Sprinkles and Speckles live stream that was a part of the Sock Blank Special 2. In this live stream, we dyed a combination of homemade and commercial KnitPicks strobe blanks using sprinkles, Kool-Aid, and even a paintbrush in concentrated Wilton's food coloring to give us speckled techniques that will really shine once we unravel these blanks. Ultimately, many of the techniques that we explored in the Sock Blank Special 2 week lead to speckled yarn. By the very nature of dyeing a pre-knit piece of fabric, you get some resist around the knit stitches, which gives you some variation of color, and therefore can lead to some brilliant speckling, especially when you have an uneven application of color on one side of the fabric versus the other. In the blanks that we were looking at in this recap, we were using techniques that you can use on just a skein of yarn to get speckles. You aren't limited to doing this onto a knit blank. However, these techniques give some really great pop to the blanks and is a way to make them a little more visually interesting if you're going to give someone an intact blank. A lot of these blanks in particular are gorgeous on their own right, and it's almost a shame to unravel them. However, I know that stunning things can be made out of the yarn, and dyeing blanks of fabric is just a really fun way to add another level to your home dyeing adventures. We started this live stream with one of my favorite hand painting speckling techniques, where you use really concentrated dye and some sort of tool, in this case we used a paintbrush, to apply little specks of the color onto your yarn. I used two different double-stranded blanks, a KnitPicks strobe blank on top and a double-stranded homemade Wool of the Andes worsted blank on the bottom. The strobe blank is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, and the Wool of the Andes blank is just 100% wool. And already when we're zoomed out, you can see the difference in the way that the colors spread on the superwash yarn versus the 100% wool yarn. I barely diluted the dyes. We dipped the paintbrush almost into just intact icing color and used it as paint to dab Wilton's burgundy, Wilton's violet, royal blue, and cornflower blue onto the blanks. I selected these four colors because they're ones that I know that break. So in addition to getting this pink to blue gradient that I thought would be fun, when we look closer, you'll see tiny amounts of breaking around these specks. There's the tiniest amount of breaking around the burgundy, but this is something that becomes a lot more apparent once we get to look at the violet. I mean, we know Wilton's violet breaks beautifully. The royal blue breaks with this sort of bright blue halo. On the 100% wool yarn, you can see the red number 3 that is in this colorway, because you see the more purple specks in the center as the colors spread out so much more. This was the first time I had used cornflower blue, and the color that breaks around is a lot more teal than the violet. And I'm curious about how similar this color is to delphinium blue. Both of these blanks were pre-soaked in tap water with at least 2 tablespoons of white vinegar before we added on the food coloring. Then I wrapped them up in plastic wrap and steamed them for 20 to 30 minutes in a steamer basket on the stovetop to set the color. I dyed both sides of the double-stranded blank that I made out of Wool in the Andes. This is a blank that I knit in the round on my Singer knitting machine, and I wanted there to be speckles throughout the yarn when we unravel it. There is some color penetration to the wrong side of this hand-painted blank, but some of the color penetration is really more of the way that the colors break. You don't see as much of the reds. You see a lot more of the blues on the back. So if I fold it over so you can see both sides, you can see a lot more of the reds and purples on the front side versus the wrong side of the fabric. If we had done this technique on just bare yarn, we would have ended up with a really cool speckled gradient. But the thing that's nice about these blanks is that we have a gradient of color. You can see that I sort of overlap the specks in some of the transition areas. But as we unravel this, these sort of long dashes of color will become smaller and we'll get an amazing speckled gradient that has breaking within the speckles. I am unbelievably excited to unravel these yarns. This blank I made on my Singer knitting machine using 2 strands of KnitPicks Hawthorne yarn. This yarn is 80% superwash wool, 20% polyamide, which is a type of nylon. On the wrong side, I used my Misto spray bottle that was still full after the last live stream to apply some color. I wanted there to be a lot of specks when I unravel this, but since this is a double-sided blank, I didn't want there to be big patches of white. And I thought that this teal would help bring together all of the random colors that we're going to get from the sprinkles on the other side. I'm going to insert a picture that shows the yarn with the sprinkles on it next to the finished yarn, so that way you can get a better sense of what sprinkle led to what kind of color. I used almost every shape of sprinkle imaginable that I could get my hands on to dye this yarn. We had black sprinkles in different shapes, the non-parallel balls, the longer ice cream sprinkles, and even sugar sprinkles that were surprisingly opaque and looked a little bit like shaved obsidian. All of these black sprinkles gave us slightly different shapes as we added them onto our yarn. The rainbow non-parallels give a really bright punch of color that I think is wonderful on almost any yarn. The violet ice cream sprinkles that were long gave much more of a pink tone to the yarn than the sprinkles and the little round balls. The pink, green, and purple sugar sprinkles give tiny little specks of color, and it's something that I love using on superwash yarns. I think that they are fantastic on just skeins of yarn and that you don't even really need to use them on a blank. But the best part about these sugar sprinkles is that they dissolve really nicely, and it's really easy to wash everything that's left over out of the yarn. This yarn was coated in a little bit of goo, and it took a lot of rinsing to get everything that was left behind from the larger sprinkles out of the yarn. Nevertheless, I think that this yarn will be absolutely stunning when we unravel it, and I cannot wait to see how it turns out. I dyed 2 KnitPicks stroll blanks in a large catering pan using a variety of food coloring, Kool-Aid, and sprinkles to create these really awesome speckled gradients. In both of the cases, I added hot water to the pan and then added the blank that was pre-soaked with no acid. I then started sprinkling Kool-Aid. In this case, it was a mixture of grape and cherry Kool-Aid onto the blank with more at one end and sort of sprinkling less and less of the Kool-Aid as I went down. Now, not only did the Kool-Aid provide little specks on the fabric itself, and you can see even in the darker sections how we have this really uneven application and how quickly the colors struck to the yarn in the low immersion setup. But the Kool-Aid also provided the acid source. So the rest of the color that was in the pan was able to start striking to the yarn because of the citric acid that was in the Kool-Aid. And I used a really cool OXO spoon wand to dust the Kool-Aid powder onto the yarn. You see some striping on this blank because it was sort of wrinkled up when it was in the pan, because I think the pan is 24 inches long and the blank is a bit longer than that. So this also shows just how quickly the food coloring strikes, and you can almost visualize the way these wrinkles were on the blank. Finally, I wanted to use the rainbow non-parallel sprinkles in this low immersion setup. And so I sprinkled these sprinkles onto the blank while it was in the warm pot. And you can see that we've got these small rainbow speckles of color. And that since the speckles are over multiple stitches, when we unravel the yarn, we will get these little specks in multiple strands, and I think it'll be really, really cool. With this blank, I decided to steam it. Since I was lazy and didn't want to move my filming setup to the stovetop, I used boiling water in the pan on my countertop. So there wasn't sustained heat while I was doing this, and the temperature dropped when I added the room temperature pre-soaked blank, etc., etc. Or I added this blank just to the steamer basket and steamed it for an additional 20 minutes. But while I was doing that, people wondered what would happen if I didn't steam it. So we decided to do this same technique on another blank. I dyed this stroll blank in a very similar way to the previous one. I added warm water to my chafer dish and added a tiny bit of food coloring to give a background color. The background food coloring for this one was some purple mixture, and it broke even without any acid addition. The pink started binding really quickly, and I was able to manipulate the blank through the pan so that way the blues would be all over and we'd have minimal white sections. Then I dusted Ice Blue Raspberry Lemonade Kool-Aid onto the blank in a gradient, so that way we would have more of the blue on one end than the other, giving us an overall gradient, which looks awesome. Even though blues in general spread out more than pinks, you can still see some discrete speckles from the blue Kool-Aid powder as it landed on the yarn. So you could even try using this blue Kool-Aid to speckle yarn that isn't in a blank. But all these tonal variations of color will result in some mottled speckled colors once we unravel this yarn. Finally, I added some of the black sugar sprinkles to this blank to give us these deep specks. Unfortunately, even though the sprinkles are very black, the speckles are not quite black on the blank. They might look black when you spread out, but they really are more of a deep purple. But they struck really nice, and I think that of all the sugar sprinkles, these black ones are a great candidate for using on yarn. I wanted to share the wrong side of these blanks because even though there is some of the Kool-Aid penetration all the way through, ultimately the dusting with the Kool-Aid powder leads to a lot more of the Kool-Aid color on the right side than the wrong side of the blanks. This isn't quite as light as when we use spray paint techniques, but I think is still really cool and means that we'll get a mottled speckled yarn when we unravel these. It's funny, we're adding speckles to these blanks, but all of these techniques will also lead to a speckling once we unravel the blanks, which I think is really cool. This blank is the lone blank that was not done with KnitPicks yarn. I used Wool to Dye's 4's Cashsock MCN, which is 80% superwash merino, 10% nylon, and 10% cashmere, to dye a blank with sprinkles, 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 and more sprinkles. I pre-soaked the blank in a vinegar solution, but then I added a bunch of sprinkles to the bottom of my pan before I submerged the blank and added even more sprinkles on top of it. Right now we are looking at the top side. You see the most color definition where I added the rainbow non-parallels sprinkles. The black and purple and even the blue that we added at this end sort of spread out a bunch more. When you zoom out, you can get a better sense of the speckling, but up close it gave really pretty color, but something that was a bit more of a semi-solid. I also used some sugar sprinkles, and these look like splotches of pastel color, but if you zoom in, you can sort of see where these specks landed. It's a little hard to tell on the camera. I don't think I can zoom in quite far enough, but in some places when they fell, you got itty bitty discrete specks. So it could be really fun to play with these sugar sprinkles in some low immersion techniques on yarn. I imagine that the speckling from some of these color sections will be more apparent once we unravel this blank. I knit this double-stranded blank on my loops and threads knitting machine in the round, using 2 strands of this sock yarn at a time. The colors are a lot more solid on the wrong side of the blank. You do see some modeling from some of the rainbow sprinkles that I threw down at the bottom of the pan. But since the colors had more time to start dissolving, they sort of ended up giving us some more solid patches of color overall. Even though I put this blank through a lot of rinsing after, the yarn still feels a little crunchy almost. And I think that I might need to wash it some more to get some more of the gelatin and whatever was in those sprinkles out of the yarn. If I handle it a bit, it gets soft and feels, you know, like a wonderful, wonderful yarn to touch. But this is something to keep in mind, especially when you use the vast number of sprinkles that I used to dye this blank. I'm not telling you about the crunchiness to prevent you from trying this on your own. I love dyeing yarn with these sprinkles, and this is something that I want to explore a lot. I think that with some of these, especially the nonpareil sprinkles, it's probably worth sticking to a sort of more light coverage, just because then you can really take advantage of the rainbows and you don't end up with as much modeling of color. I do not know how much of the color spreading is due to the 10% cashmere content in this yarn. This was the blank where I used the most sprinkles, but it's also a blend that I had never dyed before. So that's something else to consider as you are planning out your own projects. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I hope you had as much fun as I did during the Sock Blank Special ChemKnits Dye-Along Week. We had so many live streams and we dyed over 20 blanks. But our work isn't over. Even as I sign off on the last of these live stream recaps, I still need to unravel all of this yarn. Once all of the yarns are unraveled, you can expect one final recap that will show you the dried blanks and the yarns that they turned into. So stay tuned. Thank you everyone for all of your support. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel.